Well, today I want to continue our conversation about people who receive God's grace, God's blessing, God's favor in their life. And I want to tie it into what he says in verse 35 of Proverbs chapter 3, where he says, the wise inherit honor. And it's interesting, he uses the word here, the translator uses the word inherit, because an inheritance implies something that you received because you're part of the family, not because you earned it. In other words, there are things that parents pass on to their children, and that's a good thing according to the book of Proverbs. In fact, the book of Proverbs says that when a man is faithful, he's hardworking, he's prudent, he's wise, he's industrious, and all those kind of things, that he'll have something to pass on to his kids. And that's always a tricky thing because, even when we were talking with our lawyer, our state lawyer about, the stuff that we've acquired over our lifetime. You get a house, you buy it, you pay it off, and suddenly you have an asset that's worth something. And someday my wife and I will not be here, and we want to be able to see some of that pass on to our kids and our grandkids. But the stipulation, he said, do you want to put anything or designate anything for your grandkids or great-grandkids? And I thought about it. I said, no, what I would like to do is, give it to my sons and let them decide, because they'll be in a much better position to decide when it's a good time to help the kids out. And that's where I think the problem is that I've known people who have been basically, they've inherited massive fortunes. I've known a few people actually like that. And they went from poverty to instant prosperity, and it didn't end well for any of them. I mean, they ended up, as Proverbs later on, Solomon says, inheritance that's quickly gotten comes to nothing. And so those people who talk about, well, I just wish I could win the lottery and have all this money. And it's amazing that most people who win these lotteries end up going through it faster than you can imagine. And many of them ended up in worse financial position afterwards than they were before they ever won that large amount of money. So, with riches, Solomon said, comes problems. And now I often say it's a first prophecy of the IRS. And that's certainly one of the first problems you face, because they want their portion. Usually if it's a lot, they'll take half. So you realize that there's this idea that inheritance is something that you didn't earn. And when you haven't earned it, you don't hold it in the same value. But there is one thing that we inherit because God looks at us and he says, I'm going to bless you with this, and that's honor. And it's interesting because that's the Proverbs right before this. He's talking about the humble, and here he's talking about the humble who become the inheritors of honor. And I had a friend of mine, Stanley Voca, a pastor from England, that was really impactful in my early Christian life. And one of the things he used to always say to me is, he said, the way up is always the way down, and the way down is always the way up. And then he explained it to me. He said, that God is always wanting to push us down. He wants to humble ourselves. He wants to humble ourselves before him. As Oswald Chambers once said, we never stand taller than when we're prostrate on our face before the cross of Christ. That point of humbling ourselves before God is the place where God says, when you do that, I will lift you up. And that's where I think that Dan Allender wrote an interesting book years ago. I really enjoyed it. It was called Leading with a Limp. And he basically said, I don't trust any leader who doesn't walk with a limp. And he was referring to Jacob, whose hip was broken as he wrestled with the angel of God. And it was only as he wrestled with the angel of God that he moved from being Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, to being Israel, the prince of God. And the same thing is really true, I think, in our lives, that when we really do embrace the things that God does that are humbling, and he does it to all of us. Sometimes, somebody will tell me, well, wow, that was so insightful and you have such wisdom. And then something really stupid will come out of my mouth. And I'll look at myself and go, I don't even know where that came from. Well, the point of the matter is that I think God sometimes is saying, don't forget who you are. There's a story, and I think it's true, I've read it from a few sources, so I believe it's true, that oftentimes when a Roman general, a proconsul, had led a great victory against one of Rome's enemies, that they would have a triumph for him, a great celebration where he would be honored, and he would, come riding in on a 6 white horses pulling his gold-covered chariot, and people will be throwing accolades to him and yelling great things about him and praising him, and they would put a slave right behind him. And he would whisper into that consul's ear over and over again, "You're just a man, you're just a man, you're just a man, you're just a man." And I think oftentimes I find that when I feel that God has showed up when I'm doing a teaching or preaching or doing some evangelism, something. I mean, I get up there and I just speak, and it's from God's heart to my lips and to their ears. You just go, there's a powerful moment in which the Holy Spirit moved. And there's such a temptation at that moment to kind of touch the glory. Not a lot, not to grasp it, but just kind of massage it a little bit. Well, I know it was God, but he did choose me, and he must have chosen me for a reason. And we start flattering ourselves. And the thing is that I always, I say often, you've probably heard me say it before, where God has spoken through donkeys in the past, and he'll speak through many in the future. And there's no great thing, there's no great honor in being able to say, God spoke through me, or God gave me a word, or God ministered. I used to have people who would come up to me and say, "The Lord gave me a prophecy for you, brother," and they would spout off some things. And there was a couple of times where people were spot on, but most of the time they were people who were trying to ingratiate themselves by flattering me with some idea of greatness and splendor. And as one great Christian leader once said, the flattery will never hurt you as long as you don't suck it in. And if you do, he says, it's poisonous and it'll kill you. And so it's one of those kind of things you realize that God honors you as long as you don't begin to claim the honor as being from yourself. It's an inheritance. It's something that was given to you. I mean, oftentimes I wear one of these rings that my father passed on to me. It's not extra special. I'm for sure it's not really that valuable, but it is valuable to me because it was passed on to me. And so I treasure it. I care for it. I recognize that it was something that he bestowed upon me out of his kindness and his goodness. And so, the reality is that we oftentimes become the recipients of things that God bestows upon us. He gives us wives and husbands and children and grandchildren if we're able to be. He's given us friends. He's given us a community of believers. He's given us a place to live. He's given us food to eat. He's given a modicum of respect and concern and care from others. And all of that, we like to look at ourselves and say, because I'm such a wonderful person, people treat me nicely. When in fact, God says, no, don't put your eyes on that. That's not the prize of the high calling. The prize is when you reach heaven and you look at God as Jesus said we should view ourselves. He says, after you've done everything that you've been called to do, he said, always say, I am only an unworthy servant who's only done that which is my duty to do. I'm an unworthy servant who's only done that which is my duty to do. And I oftentimes look around me and I think to myself, when I get to heaven, I'm going to probably see some people here who don't have a high profile and aren't recognized, and people don't know that much about them, but they're going to be of greater treasures in heaven. Because while I was busily spending time writing and preparing messages to do my best and to give my best, they were on their face before God and interceding that God would somehow speak through this donkey once again. That's where Charles Spurgeon has a great story where he said, somebody asked him in an interview one time, what's the secret of your success of your ministry? And he said, follow me. And he led them down the stairs into a back room, and he opened it up, and there was a group of people on their knees praying fervently to God that he would reach London for England and for Christ. And, and then he closed the door and he said, that's the furnace that fuels this place. That's the engine that drives this ministry. And I thought to myself, what a profound insight. No wonder he was so greatly used, because he didn't think it was him. And I think that's the secret. The wise man, he shows his wisdom not by his boasting, but rather by his humility. that no matter how much you know, you realize you don't really know all that much. And there's certainly a lot of people around you that know far more and you can learn from. But the fool is something that has no sense of that. He is dull. He is arrogant. Dull means you can't penetrate him. There's a hardness there. And as a consequence, he said, all that person will ever experience is disgrace and dishonor and confusion and shame. Shame is the word he uses. And shame is not something that any of us want to be participants in. So how do we avoid shame? By humility. Not by seeking to get our name in lights, but to rather to get Christ's name in lights. That my pastor used to say very interestingly, he said, I strive to be so transparent that when I preach, the only thing they see is Jesus. They don't see me. And when you have that attitude, God will trust you with stuff. And when you don't, well, you'll find that God will humble you. Well, we'll continue tomorrow. Blessings.